Number 10. Nicole Cadwallader. On June the 4th of 2018, Nicole Cadwallader walked into a police station in Montgomery County, Maryland, and confessed to murdering her grandmother, Sharon Burke, whom she referred to as a wretched, evil woman. To verify the 30-year-old woman's unprompted confession, officers were dispatched to the house that she'd reportedly shared with the victim, who was 68 at the time, whereupon they discovered Burke's body on the bedroom floor. Subsequent reports indicated that the elderly woman had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck and beaten with both a pan and baseball bat. Prior to the incident, Cadwallader already had an extensive criminal record that included disorderly conduct, harassment, theft, and public drunkenness. 2 years later, on February the 24th, Cadwallader pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder as part of a plea deal after having been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. The presiding judge, Thomas Branca, sentenced her to 12 to 25 years in prison and ordered her to undergo psychiatric treatment both during her incarceration and upon her eventual release. Today's featured fan shout-out is Instagram follower Shy Synthesizer. To appear in our next video, take a pic rocking your latest merch from theywillkillyou.com and send it in to us on Instagram today. Number 9. Brittany J Duet. On August the 5th of 2016, Brittany J Duet drove to her grandfather's house in Adelaide, Australia, in order to steal the man's life savings worth over $100,000 and then murder him. The 21-year-old was accompanied by her friend and accomplice, Bernadette Burns, age 22. Upon their arrival at the home, Duet's grandfather, identified as 81-year-old Robert Whitwell, reportedly showed her and Burns some family pictures, totally unaware of his grandchild's evil intentions. Moved by her grandfather's kindness of spirit, Duet ultimately began to question her greed-fueled plan to rob and kill him. However, she subsequently received a text from Burns telling her to harden up and encouraging her to go through with the murder plot. The situation culminated with Duet stabbing Whitwell in the neck and chest, but she didn't immediately flee the scene. Instead, she helped her grandfather apply a bandage to the wounds she'd inflicted and began doing the dishes as the victim bled out in the other room. Whitwell's body was found 3 days later, and during their initial probe into the matter, investigators didn't suspect that the victim's family had been responsible for his death. An anonymous tip eventually led them to discover Duet and Burns' participation in the crime, and on August the 26th of 2016, both girls were arrested. Duet was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment, while her accomplice will become eligible for parole in 2029. Number 8. Andrea Leah Wilson. On May the 15th of 2018, 28-year-old Andrea Leah Wilson paid a visit to her grandmother, Ruby Ross, in Bentonville, Arkansas. After dinner, Wilson reportedly waited for her grandma to fall asleep, at which point she proceeded to bludgeon the elderly woman to death in her bed. The following morning, Ross's daughter arrived at the house and discovered her body, which had sustained a large open wound to the head. The police were promptly called to the scene, and upon examining the house, investigators found rubber gloves, a bank statement in Wilson's name, and a hammer covered in the victim's blood and hair, discarded in a trash bag. Wilson was arrested and ultimately confessed to killing her grandmother, allegedly believing she would be damned to hell unless she offered God a sacrifice. Earlier on the day of the murder, the woman had reportedly attempted to run over a cyclist with her car, consequently ejecting him off his bike. Although the prosecution initially planned to make it a capital case, they eventually accepted a plea bargain after details regarding Wilson's mental health issues came to light. The defendant had reportedly stopped taking her prescribed dose of lithium prior to the incident, and experts hired to determine whether she understood the consequences of her actions ultimately offered contradictory opinions. On April the 13th of 2021, Wilson pleaded guilty to first-degree murder as well as aggravated assault and was consequently sentenced to 36 years behind bars. Number 7. Heather Barbera. In April of 2018, Mississippi woman Heather Barbera moved back in with her mother and grandmother in New Jersey to help her manage some of the problems associated with her prolonged substance abuse issues. The woman's already strained relationship with her relatives, identified as 67-year-old Michelle Gordon and 87-year-old Elaine Rosen, ultimately reached a boiling point on July the 8th of that same year. 42-year-old Barbera reportedly attacked both women with a blunt object before fleeing the state. After the bodies were found by Gordon's brother, police launched an investigation, leading to the discovery that Barbera had stolen the victims' credit cards and had been using them to make purchases in New York City. She was tracked down to Midtown Manhattan and arrested 3 days later. While in custody, Barbera admitted to striking her mother with her late father's police nightstick during a contentious argument. She then shifted her rage towards Rosen after the elderly woman had tried to intervene. Barbera pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter in October of 2019, but her lawyer requested that she be given a lenient sentence due to her history of substance abuse and the toxic and very unhealthy family dynamic that had existed in the household. The defendant was ultimately sentenced to 30 years in prison for Gordon's murder and 12 years for Rosen's, to be served consecutively. Number 6. Paula Montoya. On July the 21st of 2016, Los Angeles police were dispatched to the home of 64-year-old Paula Montoya at the behest of her son, who lived out of state and hadn't heard from her in several days. The woman's body, which presented signs of strangulation, broken ribs and head trauma, was discovered inside the bathroom, having been wrapped in plastic. Montoya's 24-year-old granddaughter, Sarah, had reportedly been the last person to see her alive. After investigators learned that Sarah had abandoned her car near the US border and had fled to Mexico with her children, she became the police's prime suspect. An international arrest warrant was issued, and on August the 8th of 2016, Sarah was extradited back to Los Angeles, where she faced charges of manslaughter and kidnapping, the latter of which stemmed from the fact that she'd fled the country without the authorization of her children's father. While being interrogated, Sarah allegedly admitted to having snapped during an argument with her grandmother, whom she'd choked to death. The young woman pleaded no contest to her charges and in July of 2019 was sentenced to 26 years in prison. Number 5. Harley Swoles. A concerned resident of Enfield, Connecticut, called 911 on August the 12th of 2021 after hearing screams coming from her neighbor's apartment. Police arrived at the scene, whereupon they discovered the homeowner, 73-year-old Mary Rose Riak, unconscious but alive on the floor. Officers also came upon the lifeless body of the woman's boyfriend, James Samuel Bell, as well as her granddaughter, Harley Swoles, who was covered in blood. Riak was rushed to the hospital, where she would die later that same day. It subsequently emerged that 22-year-old Swoles had been forbidden from entering her grandmother's home after a previous domestic disturbance in July. She told investigators that she'd broken in to retrieve her possessions, but that Riak had caught her before a violent argument ensued. Both Riak and Bell were reportedly stabbed over a dozen times during the altercation and displayed severe defensive wounds. As of the latest updates on the case, Swoles was still awaiting the commencement of her criminal trial. Number 4. Angela Wamsley. Nellie Sullivan, a 93-year-old resident of Candler, North Carolina, who suffered from dementia, was classified as a missing person for 2 years before investigators finally found her body on April the 14th of 2022. Sullivan's granddaughter, Angela Wamsley, aged 46, and the latter's husband, 50-year-old Alan Barnes, were arrested in connection to her 2020 disappearance. Neighbors had notified the police that the elderly woman hadn't been seen for several years. Shortly thereafter, Wamsley and Barnes became the investigation's prime suspects, as they'd allegedly been cashing Sullivan's retirement checks even after she'd gone missing. It wouldn't be until the new owners of Sullivan's home saw their pet duck running underneath the house that they discovered a drum containing the missing woman's remains. Wamsley and her husband were charged with murder and were scheduled to appear in court on May the 13th of 2022. Number 3. Chantima Wangwatki. In 2022, Thai woman Chantima Wangwatki was accused of embezzling money from her grandmother-in-law, T. Sa Fu. In May of that year, the latter began to suspect that she'd been deceived into signing official documents that granted 26-year-old Wangwatki control over several of her bank accounts. Fu promptly demanded her money back, but her grandchild refused, instead opting to fatally strangle the 70-year-old woman to keep the details of her financial fraud a secret. Following the cold-blooded murder, Wangwatki made an effort to clean up the scene of the crime to make it look like a robbery gone awry. Neighbors later told the police that they'd seen Wangwatki flee in the victim's home, and an arrest warrant was subsequently issued for her. Once in police custody, the young woman admitted to stealing nearly $6,000 from her grandmother-in-law before committing the murder. Wangwatki claimed, however, to have acted under a sudden, ungovernable mood swing, and thus argued that she shouldn't be held completely responsible for her actions. As of the case's latest updates, legal procedures against the defendant was still ongoing. Number 2. Sarah Elizabeth Smith. In October of 2019, police responded to a home in Rowan County, North Carolina, where resident Peggy Austin had been found dead at the bottom of the staircase. Investigators postulated that the 87-year-old woman's death had been the result of an unfortunate accident. However, after medical examiners conducted an autopsy, it was concluded that Austin's injuries were too severe to support their initial theory. Detectives questioned Austin's living granddaughter, 28-year-old Sarah Elizabeth Smith, and her boyfriend, 43-year-old Brandon Scott Jones. On December the 23rd of 2019, Smith was arrested and charged with embezzlement after it emerged that she'd been fraudulently using her grandmother's money while she was already under police investigation. During her subsequent interrogation, the suspect ultimately confessed to pushing her grandmother down the flight of stairs on the night of the deadly incident, and she was consequently charged with second-degree murder. Her boyfriend was also criminally charged for allegedly aiding and abetting both the embezzlement and murder. Number 1. Catherine Sieber. New York teen Catherine Sieber was accused of using an electrical cord to strangle her 91-year-old great-grandmother at her home in Stillwater on February the 12th of 2000. Following her resulting criminal trial the following year, Sieber was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but the verdict was ultimately overturned 11 years later. State forensic analyst Gary Vida reportedly confessed to tampering with evidence in over 100 cases with which he was involved during his career, including Witter's murder investigation. Vida would go on to take his own life in 2008 before the case against him ever went to trial. Sieber faced a less severe resentencing following her acquittal and was released from custody on July the 16th of 2012. Soon after being paroled, Sieber reportedly started dating a man named Pedro Sanchez. The relationship quickly turned violent when the 38-year-old man, having accused Sieber of being unfaithful, fatally stabbed her in the torso and face in her Queens apartment. Despite his best efforts to cover up the scene of the slaying, Sanchez was ultimately arrested and charged with second-degree murder, criminal possession of a weapon, tampering with evidence, and resisting arrest. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click on one of the links on your screen for more videos.